You're a highly sought-after actress with a hit sitcom, living alone in Hollywood. There's a knock at your door one morning. A man you do not know, who doesn't say much, hands you a letter and an autograph he'd once received from your fan club. Getting a strange feeling? Before closing the door, you ask him nicely to never come to your home again. An hour later, he's back. Only this time, he has a .357 Magnum in his hand. My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and the true crime author of close to 50 books. I've dedicated the past 20 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me. We're crossing the line. During her early teen years, Rebecca Schaeffer would talk about wanting to become a rabbi one day. Part of it centered around Rebecca earning the position of president within her temple's youth group. And yet, Rebecca's true nature, those who knew her best would say her greatest purpose had always been a yearning to help others. Instead of choosing that religious path, however, when she turns 16, Rebecca makes the bold decision to instead leave home for New York City and pursue her other passion, acting. Rebecca's parents could have reacted in any number of ways, but chose to support their daughter's choice to strike off on her own and follow her dream. Rebecca has this internal drive few of those around her can match, which is something a budding actress needs perhaps more than anything. An ability to, in the face of continuous rejection, persevere and allow criticism not necessarily to bounce off, but become the fuel for the fire of success burning inside you. So, in her mid-teens, Rebecca Schaeffer sets out from her home in Oregon for New York City and the hope of one day becoming a model and actress. Few true crime cases from the 80s and 90s stir big memories for me. I was not a true crime fan then, or even an avid true crime reader. I did indulge, I have to admit, in the salacious movie of the week on network television from time to time, whether crime or not, but I think like most of us back then, didn't categorize things into genres and labels as much as we do today. A good book was a good book. A good movie? A good movie. Of course, everyone knew the huge names: O.J., Menendez, Jean Benet, etc. The one case I do vividly recall being greatly interested in begins in the early 80s, actually, just as Rebecca Schaeffer is settling into her new life in Manhattan. 10-year-old Manchester, Maine resident Samantha Smith writes a letter to Soviet leader Yuri Andropov spelling out her concerns over peace between the nations. I have been worrying about Russia and the United States getting into a nuclear war, Samantha writes. Are you going to vote to have a war or not? She asks Andropov. This is a very tenuous time when the U.S. and Russia seem to be standing toe-to-toe on the brink of major conflict. Nuclear war is on the minds of everyone. And here you have a child asking the head of the Soviet Union's KGB and also the General Secretary of Russia if his country is planning to push the button. God made the world for us to share, Samantha writes near the end of that letter. Samantha is soon invited to the Soviet Union after Andropov receives the letter. From there, she is known as a peace activist and becomes a media sensation. Eventually, Samantha is offered an acting role and cast in the television series Lime Street, starring opposite Hollywood A-lister Robert Wagner. Her star is rising. But then tragedy strikes in 1985. Sadly, Samantha and her father are killed in a small plane crash. Unbeknownst to her at the time, Rebecca Schaeffer and Samantha Smith share a connection. With big-time fame comes more than the occasional odd individual, especially for females with high profiles. Celebrity in the 80s was obviously far different than it is today. If you became famous then, everyone knew who you were, simply because there were 3 major television networks and no internet. So you were effectively everywhere. Today, someone can be adored and praised by millions, with still millions more having never heard of the person. There are YouTubers and Instagrammers with 100+ million followers who've never been on television or the cover of a magazine. Back in the 80s and even the early 90s, when you became a recognizable celebrity, especially a teen, your story made the rounds. 17 magazine, maybe Rolling Stone, the cover of TV Guide for sure, and a coveted role on a series in a primetime lineup of mega hit shows bringing in 20, 30, even 40 million people each week to watch. With that type of exposure, the dark side of fame is always looming: obsession and stalking. You've heard me say this on this show before, that these types of behaviors are at the top of the danger zone and rarely de-escalate in any way over time. The emotional toll on the victim of a stalker, which I think we need to discuss more, is devastating. Anxiety, depression, isolation, feelings of being constantly unsafe and afraid to go anywhere, along with a deep sense of hopelessness. Anyone who has been stalked can attest to how these types of situations entirely overwhelm the victim's life 24/7, with post-traumatic stress generally to follow. Before her death, as Samantha Smith's profile grew, after she began appearing on television, an obsessive stalker had latched onto her, simply because he had seen her on television. Samantha's stalker is actually young himself then, just 17. His infatuation with Samantha began with the coverage of her trip to the Soviet Union. As she travels to Russia to visit the government, he decides to travel from his home in Arizona all the way to Maine to meet Samantha upon her return. His plans are thwarted only when he has a brief encounter with police while he is in Maine and decides to return home, instead of going through with confronting Samantha. Upon his return home, he decides he is going to definitely confront Samantha soon. Confront is the right word choice here, because I am not talking about a fan outside a hotel with a group of others in search of an autograph or glimpse of an idol. What we have here is a guy who is going to proclaim his endless love for his obsession. He thinks he has a shot at being with this person. Samantha is, mind you, a 13-year-old child at the time. And here is a young man entirely consumed with her. The situation de-escalates only after Samantha and her father are killed when that small plane they are traveling in crashes. Most stalkers, however, if they are not caught and held accountable, and their spell on one particular subject is somehow broken, will transfer that obsession to someone new, if they don't have a second person already in mind. It's not necessarily about the person they are obsessing over specifically, more than it is about the act, the control, the feeling of you are mine because I decided you are mine. And even more importantly than that, it's not what they get out of the situation. It's how they perceive the situation. Stalking research is still in its infancy, and researchers admit they are having trouble understanding it. But there's no question that stalking is a personality disorder with underlying issues of mental illness. What's confusing for researchers is how the stalker sees his or her behavior. In a July 2023 Scientific American article focused on how psychologists are struggling to explain the mind of the stalker, Francine Russo writes that, while some offenders have serious mental health problems, others are shocked to discover their behavior is classified as stalking. I think what she's talking about there is, the guy whose girlfriend breaks up with him. He can't handle that rejection. So he starts following her to work, following her when she goes out at night. He does not view that as stalking. He views it as keeping an eye on his possession, which is, in turn, stalking. I have written enough about stalking to understand that the offender, in some way, shape, or form, usually understands that what he or she is doing is wrong in most situations. They may be disillusioned to think that their victim in some way has shown signs of interest, but most celebrity stalkers have an idea that their target likely doesn't even know they exist. As the death of Samantha Smith shocks and saddens millions, young Rebecca Schaeffer, now living in New York City, emerges on the modeling scene with a promising career in Hollywood ahead of her. Everybody knows this. Everybody can sense it. Oregon-born, by 1984, Miss Schaeffer is attending the Professional Children's School and also holding down a job to support herself when her career takes off. By the end of 1984, Rebecca is the talk of Hollywood after landing a role on the hugely popular soap opera, One Life to Live. Remember, this is a time when millions of people watch soap operas on a daily basis. After her role on the soap ends, Rebecca lands one of those coveted spots on the cover of 17 magazine. A surefire way, then, to set your star on a direct upward path. I was so proud of her, Rebecca's mother later tells Jewish Journal writer Kylie Lobel. I would carry her 17 magazine around with me and show people. A lot of it is timing and looks, but more than anything else, talent. Rebecca has this incredible girl-next-door look about her. Long, very curly, dark black hair, thick and bouncy. A smile that stops people in their tracks. She just has that star quality about her. Yet beyond all of that, she is an extremely talented actress. A package that is harder to find in Hollywood than you might think. As Rebecca's star is rising, CBS is casting for a new sitcom to continue actress Pam Dauber's career after the wild success of Mork and Mindy, a mega sitcom she starred in with Robin Williams. The new show is called My Sister Sam. Rebecca Schaeffer walks into an audition and it's like magic. There she is, Pam Dauber's co-star. They knew it right away. The first season of the show is a huge hit, which leads to other roles for Rebecca. As I mentioned, movies of the week, those ripped from the headlines, true crime dramas, were all the rage back in those days. It felt as if every high-profile murder case had a movie of the week adaptation, with celebs of their moment in the starring roles. Farrah Fawcett, for example, one of Charlie's Angels, starred in the 1984 movie The Burning Bed, based on the true story of housewife Francine Hughes, who murdered her husband by burning the house down after lighting the bed on fire. Farrah Fawcett plays Hughes, who had been the victim of severe physical abuse for 13 years leading up to the murder. This newfound stardom and high-profile visibility puts Rebecca Schaeffer on the map in Hollywood. She is suddenly everywhere and up for several different roles in television movies and big-budget major films. In fact, her manager had just given Rebecca the news that she has a shot at getting in on The Godfather, Part 3. Now an adult himself, that same stalker who had obsessed over peace activist Samantha Smith begins to notice Rebecca Schaeffer. He's been watching her star rise, and before long, Rebecca now becomes the new target of his obsession. My longtime listeners know that I rarely suggest podcasts. Yet a good friend who is responsible for bringing me into the podcast arena, Lauren Bright Pacheco, an incredibly detailed and tenacious Emmy Award-winning producer, investigative journalist, and veteran podcaster, just launched her latest, Murder on Songbird Road, a multi-part limited series from iHeartMedia focused on the stabbing death of 11-year-old Jade Marie Beasley in the contentious conviction of her father's fiancé. I cannot recommend this series enough. You can listen to Murder on Songbird Road on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your favorite shows. Let's take our first break here. Come right back. Rebecca Schaeffer is enjoying the life she has worked so hard to build for herself. Living in Hollywood now, working in the industry, auditioning for some of the biggest roles in film, starring in a hit network series. She has no idea, and how would she until he does something, that a madman, essentially, is at home staring at her on television every week, sitting at the kitchen table, clipping articles and photos of her, fantasizing about being with her. And so one day, this man sits down and pens a letter to Rebecca, the first of many. Not a gushy fan letter, though. He knows enough at this stage not to come on too strong. So he keeps it to a sort of generic, I am a big fan and you are great, and can I get an autograph and a picture? I suspect he has no idea that an assistant reads all of her fan mail and also responds. Not actually Rebecca. This is a dude who stalked a 13-year-old girl, a guy who has a troubled history of being abused by family members and has been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. At best, he is unstable. At worst, not receiving treatment, he is a powder keg, ready to explode. His name is Robert John Bardo. He has a kind of large forehead, made more prominent perhaps by his premature baldness, with strange, beady, dark, directionless eyes and an odd sense of quiet about him. Bardo grew up in Arizona. To look at Bardo, it's clear something is off with the guy. He is struggling. He doesn't have any friends to speak of and cannot hold down even the simplest of jobs. By 1989, Bardo has been stalking Rebecca for many years, tracking every major part of her career. When she first landed the role in My Sister Sam, opposite Pam Dauber, Rebecca moves in with Dauber and her actor husband, Mark Harmon. Dauber had lost her own sister when she was 25 and her sister just 22. Not only were the living arrangements good for the chemistry of the series, but for Dauber herself. Eventually, Rebecca finds her own place above Sunset Strip, sort of in the Hollywood Hills. It is away from the city, but close enough. As she began living in the hills alone, Rebecca begins to feel isolated, so she moves to Sweetser Avenue, just east of Beverly Hills in West Los Angeles. Rebecca has this natural, charming disposition about her. Everyone loves the young woman. Her warmth captivates those around her. There were not many young people like Rebecca in Hollywood, humble, grateful, passionate about the craft of acting. Stardom isn't what she sought, it came with her achieving her goals. Robert Bardo had grown up with 6 siblings. His father was in the military, so as you can imagine, the family moved around a lot. One thread in the fabric of the Bardo family is mental illness. And it was one of Bardo's siblings who wound up abusing him the worst. Looking at Bardo's life, he never found his footing, always taking on a new blue-collar job after the previous one fell apart or he was fired or quit. After turning 19, still living in Tucson, Arizona, Bardo is now working as a pizza delivery driver. It's the end of 1986. By this time, he is entirely fixated on Rebecca, and his bedroom is completely covered with photos of her, newspaper articles, and even memorabilia from her various roles on television. Think of that stalker movie you've all seen with the stalker in his bedroom, surrounded by the face of his obsession, arms folded behind his head, lying in his bed, whispering to himself, "You'll be mine someday." You wouldn't be far off in Bardo's situation. As the number of letters he writes to Rebecca increases over the years, so does his boldness and obsessive nature. By 1988 and into 1989, he is writing to Rebecca, telling her that he is madly in love and devoted to her. He even begins to study other famous stalkers, such as John Hinckley Jr. and Mark David Chapman, who took things to the next level, confronted and shot the target of their obsession. Bardo travels to LA one day by bus to meet Rebecca. At this time, he has no idea where she lives, so he goes to the set of My Sister Sam with flowers and a teddy bear, and he demands to see her. Security realized there is something off with this dude, so they escort him off the studio lot and even make sure he gets back to his hotel after warning him not to ever return. Bardo goes back home and begins to send Rebecca gifts, stuffed animals, cards, more letters. He tells her they are destined to be together, that she is his soulmate. This is all typical stalker behavior. Progressing. We've all heard this story before. My Sister Sam is eventually canceled after the second season, but Rebecca is in big demand, especially for movie of the week roles in big screen films. One of the most dangerous issues surrounding male stalkers is the "if I can't have you, no one else will" tone their fantasy can take on after a period of rejection. This is where the stalker, who will at first do anything to protect the target of his obsession, turns and soon applies that internal rage, sense of dismissal, and dangerous thought process directly at the target. There is no way to tell when this change occurs in Bardo with regard to Rebecca, but his psychologists later agree that it takes place around the time a theatrical film Rebecca stars in is released to theaters. The movie, Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills, is a cheeky kind of film dealing with a widowed television actress and her friends. The film focuses on the sexual indiscretions within this group as the widow's husband begins to appear as a ghost. What can I say? It's Hollywood. What is different for Rebecca is that her character is entirely opposite of her My Sister Sam role, that wholesome image. And she actually has a love scene in the film. Now, before this film had come out, and after he had been tossed from the set of My Sister Sam a year or so before, Robert Bardo hires a private investigator to find out where exactly Rebecca Schaeffer is living. And his feelings for her, after seeing her perform that love scene, have gone from "you are mine and mine only, and we are soulmates," to "how dare you do this to me." One psychologist later says, this is the moment where Bardo thinks Rebecca has betrayed her innocence. Bardo sits down in July 1989 and writes a letter to his sister. In that letter, he says he has an obsession with the untainable, and because of that, he has to eliminate what he cannot attain. As I mentioned earlier in the show, despite mental illness being involved, these guys seem to know what they are doing. Here, Bardo even spells it out. After writing that letter, he boards a bus heading from Tucson to LA, armed. He has a gun, but also, in the same bag where he is hiding the weapon, he has a copy of J.D. Salinger's famous novel, Catcher in the Rye. I'll be right back to explain the connection. What is the significance of Robert Bardo carrying a copy of Catcher in the Rye with him on that Greyhound bus to Los Angeles, along with a gun and several of the letters between him and Rebecca Schaeffer's fan club? We understand why he has the weapon. But the book is important because one of the stalkers Bardo was interested in is Mark David Chapman, who shot and murdered John Lennon. Chapman is ultimately arrested while he is reading the same book and actually hands it over to law enforcement saying, "This is my statement." Later, he reads a passage from the book after being found guilty before being sentenced. So, in some way, Bardo relates to this and the situation he now finds himself in. It's all or nothing for Robert Bardo at this point. On July 18th, 1989, Rebecca Schaeffer is at home. Her agent had just told her to expect a copy of the script for The Godfather Part 3, which is slated to arrive that morning at her apartment. Also, the intercom system connected to her door is not working at the time, which forces Rebecca to open the door to see who is there. At some point, there is a knock at her door, and Rebecca, by all accounts, believes it is the studio sending over the script. So she opens the door. It's Robert Bardo. He is holding an autographed photo of her. Reports also note that Rebecca is polite and tells Bardo she has an interview with a journalist she must do and needs to go. So she closes the door. For a guy in Bardo's mental state, with the images of that film Rebecca Schaeffer was in playing in his mind, his entire focus on Rebecca has now shifted to that of someone who has rejected him. Bardo, however, leaves. He walks a few blocks to a restaurant, sits down, and begins thinking. His obsession has taken over his thought process. He has to react, do something. He cannot, in his mind, walk away without being heard. Bardo later would describe all of this to police in what is a chilling account of his thoughts and actions on that morning. He gets up from the booth inside the restaurant and heads back over to Rebecca's apartment. Bardo had written Rebecca a new letter. Knock on the door again, give her the letter, say a few words, and then whatever happens next happens. Rebecca opens the door. "I forgot to give you something," Bardo says. He hands her the letter. Rebecca is, of course, a bit irritated by his return. She had asked him not to come back. He can sense her impatience and her contempt for him. But she takes the letter, looks down, and begins reading. As she does this, Bardo pulls out a .357 Magnum, a hell of a weapon, specifically designed to kill. And at such close range as to where he stands on her doorstep, death is a certainty. Rebecca looks up, according to Bardo later, and says, "Why? Why?" Just before he fires a fatal shot into her heart. Again, repeating what I mentioned earlier, Bardo knows what he is doing is wrong and illegal. He leaves the scene and boards a bus back home as an intense search is underway in LA for Rebecca's killer. Bardo clearly understands he is hiding, running from the law. It's not as if he kills Rebecca and then snaps out of some sort of psychotic trance and says, "What have I done?" Instead, he tries his best to avoid being caught. And I think this is an important piece of this. Intent. Comprehension. Yes, he is mentally ill. Yes, he has demons inside his head, but accountability is another thing. He knew enough to plan this murder. He knew enough to hire a private investigator to get her address, who, incidentally, attained the address illegally from someone at the Department of Motor Vehicles. He knew enough to buy a return ticket home in an effort to get away with the murder. Ultimately, Bardo is found running in traffic screaming, "I killed Rebecca Schaeffer." It's almost like now he's proud of what he's done. He later says the guilt got to him and he needed to come clean. I don't think I buy that. I think he wanted the notoriety. Bardo heads to trial in 1991 and is found guilty. Incidentally, Marcia Clark, known as one of the infamous O.J. Simpson prosecutors who's built an entire career around her work in the O.J. case, is the lead prosecutor in Bardo's case. As the trial unfolds, it's clear that Bardo had set himself on a crash course toward violence. LA Times reporter Christopher Goffard wrote a long piece about Bardo and dug up letters Bardo wrote as far back as high school in which Bardo had proclaimed, quote, "I am going to be the next Hitler," end quote, and "the devil must kill." So every indication was there early on that Bardo would eventually do something. Yet no one within his circle ever stepped up to see that he was hospitalized or got the most beneficial help he could. Turned out, singers Debbie Gibson and Tiffany were also objects of Bardo's obsession. He is ultimately sentenced to life in prison. California's first anti-stalking laws were enacted because of this case. And those laws led to similar laws in other states and even countries. It does not obviously do anything to lessen the pain for Rebecca's family and friends. But it is something. 30 years after Rebecca's murder, her mother, Dana Schaeffer, wrote, produced, and began performing a one-woman show based on the family story called You in Midair. Please subscribe to Crossing the Line wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to leave a review of the show, especially on Apple Podcasts. I'm doing this show independently now, free from any corporate or big podcasting media company involvement, which allows me to bring you more of the content you want to hear and have asked me for. This is completely our show. Reviews and subscriptions really help. You are my public relations and social media team now, and without your help, I could not do this. And that support, I must tell you, means everything. It's incredibly humbling, and I want to thank each one of you for listening. We can grow the show together, which will allow me to do even bigger things with it. If you go to crossingtheline.biz or mwilliamphelps.com, you can contact me there to suggest cases or just say hello. And look for me across all social media platforms at M. William Phelps. That's the @ symbol and my name, M. William Phelps. That's it for this week. Be safe. Be aware. Sources for this episode include Murder of LA Actress Led to Country's First Anti-Stalking Laws by Amy Ta, NPR, KCRW, May 21st, 2024. The Trial of Robert Bardo, Transcripts and Video. Mother of Murdered Actress Pays Tribute with You in Midair by Kylie Lobel, Jewish Journal, May 23rd, 2018. Crossing the Line is executive produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, and Matthew Valentinas, Mom's Basement Management. Written by me, M. William Phelps. Audio mastering and mixing by Matt Russell. Original music written and performed by Thomas Mooney, Tom Phelps, and Matt Russell.